All right, welcome back. So this is part 2 of the plagiarism video lecture. Again, just broken up in the interest of time. So just to recap a little bit, the last video lecture I talked about kind of the 3 ways to cite sources to avoid plagiarism. Again, if we're using the correct MLA 8 or 9 in-text citation. So we have direct quotes, paraphrases, and summaries. And again, what I talked about is if you're using a direct quote, it's word for word what somebody else has said, and you're using the MLA in-text citation. A paraphrase, you're probably not going to have quotation marks. You're just rewording the original statement, very different from just, replacing words with synonyms. What you're doing is taking what somebody else has said, thinking about it, processing it, and putting it into your own words. And a summary takes a huge amount of information and condenses it down into maybe a couple sentences. So we talked about this sort of idea of a conversation. But I want to get into a little bit more the idea of paraphrasing, and we could spend a lot of time on paraphrasing and summarizing. And if you're interested in more kind of detail on how to go about this, please let me know, and I'd be happy to either explain it to you or point you to some other resources. So paraphrasing, if we had this same quote that we used for the intentionally plagiarizing thing, right? And we wanted to paraphrase it, we can see that if we paraphrase it, we're basically putting this in our own words, and we're not going to have the quotation marks, but we are going to have an in-text citation. So a legitimate paraphrase, you can see in research papers, students often quote excessively, failing to keep quoted material down to a desirable level. Since the problem usually originates during note-taking, it's essential to minimize the material recorded verbatim. So again, same idea. Different wording. This is in the student's own words, but we still do have the in-text citation because all of those ideas are from somebody else. Now, there are a couple of nuanced things to this, such as if you're kind of paraphrasing, where do you put the in-text citation? And the easy answer is you should put the in-text citation as close as possible to the other person's ideas. Another way to do that in this case would be to simply reword a little bit and say, according to Lester, in research papers, students often quote excessively, and then end with the parenthetical in-text citation. I think that's the best way to do it because it shows essentially where that paraphrase begins, which is according to Lester, and where it ends, which would be with the citation. Okay, so understanding kind of summarizing sources. So again, this is a way to, like with a conversation example, take a huge piece of information and distill it down, condensing really large amounts of information, maybe taking out highly technical things that are unnecessary for what you're working on, and basically takes what are just the high points. What are the main points, or maybe the one main point of the source that you want to take away? And it's really, really helpful for avoiding those extremely long quotes, which we generally call block quotes. So in MLA style, any quote that's going to take up more than 5 lines in your essay needs to be in a specific format, which is fun, right? Because we need more specific formatting things from MLA. But basically, it's a block format. So, we're removing the quotation marks, indenting the quote, all these other details, which, again, I'd be happy to go into. But what we should ask ourselves if we're going to use a really long quote, again, one that's longer than 5 lines of our paper, is A, is it entirely necessary? B, what is my reader possibly going to do with a long quote? Because I think if most readers are like me, the automatic sort of tendency is to want to skip over a block quote. And so I would recommend that you lean more towards summarizing than towards block quotes, if at all possible, just because they can become overwhelming and it's a lot of somebody else's voice rather than your own. Okay, so a couple other little things here. Number one, can you plagiarize yourself? And I talked about this a little bit in the previous plagiarism part 1, and I said I'd talk about it later, so here it is. Can you plagiarize yourself? And the answer is yes. However, it's kind of an extremely rare situation and not one that you should be too worried about. The it's not necessarily like, if you wrote a first draft and a final draft, that's plagiarizing yourself, right? It actually would occur more if you took, say, Psych 101 last quarter and you wrote a paper that you feel like, oh, hey, I could just turn this paper in again for my English class. That would count as self-plagiarism. And the reason is that you already turned that paper in for a grade. So it's actually work done for a different class. Now, again, I agree that it might seem a little bit silly. And so let's kind of talk about that example, because I do have students ask quite often. So let's say, same example, you wrote a paper in your psychology class last quarter about social media and anxiety in teenagers. And you want to kind of continue exploring that topic. That's totally okay. You can even use some of the same resources. What you can't do is turn in the same paper or turn in a paper that's basically comprised of all the same paragraphs. So if you have any questions, let me know. It's very easy to sort of discuss. I want to put it out there just as something that's on your radar. I would say most of the time I would even count this as intentional plagiarism, because it should be relatively obvious, at least to my way of thinking, that if you turned in a paper for another class and got an A on it, you can't just simply take the same paper and turn it in for another class. Okay, so last thing that I want to talk about, I think, last couple of things. One is common knowledge. So common knowledge is a little bit tricky, because common knowledge is, maybe not so common. And so when we think about common knowledge, the way it applies to plagiarism is, well, if I think everybody knows something, do I need a citation? So it's kind of tricky, and more tricky than I think it could be or might be. So common knowledge includes information that you can find in most any source on a topic. So if you think of a fact, like an obvious, straightforward fact, something like George Washington was the first president of the United States, I don't necessarily need a source for that. Primarily because that's going to appear anywhere that I look up George Washington, right? If I'm using the wording of somebody else, then I need to put that in quotations and provide a citation. So, for example, if I come across a source that says, extremely popular at the time, George Washington was reluctantly elected as the first president of the United States, and I use exact wording, then I need to include the citation. And the last thing that you should think about with kind of common knowledge is that common knowledge does depend on audience. So if you're, say, talking to your friends about a video game or a movie or something like that, they may have a shared common knowledge, right, with you, that you don't need to explain all these things. So one of the things that you'll hear me talk about probably quite a lot this quarter is audience awareness. So the more aware that we are of who we were writing for, the more we have a better idea of what to include or what to exclude. And as we think about audience, again, I would encourage you not to think of your audience for your essays as simply me as your instructor, but as a generally knowledgeable group of your peers. Okay, so how do you avoid plagiarizing accidentally, right? Because again, despite our best intentions, it is still possible. Now, although there's no absolute way to prevent this from happening accidentally, you can take some easy steps that will help you avoid accidentally plagiarizing. Number one is to track all of your sources, not just the URLs, but using something like a research log, which I'll show you in a second. Number two, and I think one of the places that a lot of students go wrong, is that they don't fully understand the material that they're looking at. So what happens is, and maybe you've done this, I know that I've definitely done it in the past, you're reading something and you've got the source and you think, wow, that's really good. And you're thinking, I want to paraphrase this into my paper. So you're looking at the source and you're kind of trying to reword it as you're looking at it. What's better is read that source, make sure you fully understand it. And if you want to paraphrase it, set that aside for a second. Don't look at the original. Type it out in your own words and then compare it to the original. If it's too close and you've only changed a couple words here and there, maybe you want to go with a direct quote. But you definitely always want to include your in-text citation. Number 3 is what we call the 5-year-old or the grandma test. And if you've taken a philosophy class, you might be familiar with this. It's essentially try and explain a concept as simply as you possibly can. And there are some great YouTube videos out there where a professional, like a neuroscientist, will explain things at 5 different levels of difficulty. So they'll explain neuroscience to a 5-year-old, to an elementary school student, high school student, college student, and a graduate student. And what you'll see is when people fully understand a topic, they can usually explain it in the simplest possible terms. Okay, so I mentioned keeping track of sources, and I mentioned a reading log or a research log. So the way that I do this, and this is an example of the one that I actually use from my own research, and what I would suggest is as you're conducting research for English 102, that you keep track of all of this information. It's going to make your life easier in the long run, just as far as composing your paper, but it's also going to help you avoid plagiarism. So what I do is I have a template here. You can see it has 4 fields. And when I go in to do research, I figure out what I'm going to put into the search engine in terms of the search terms. And then if I find something that looks even a little bit promising, I fill out the rest of this. Now, there are a couple additions that I've done to this over the last couple months as I've been kind of doing even more of my own research. And the first thing that I changed is, in addition to search terms, I now also include the search engine, because I might be using Google or Google Scholar or Academic Search Complete or JSTOR. Now, why do that, you might ask? So the first thing is, if I'm tracking my search terms, I'm not going to end up repeating a search later on. And I can also see, oh, hey, I used apocalyptic stories last time, but maybe I want to use apocalyptic narratives because I'm going to get different results. Also, if I'm using different search engines, I want to make sure that, hey, if I search these terms on Google, maybe I want to go ahead and search them on Academic Search Complete. So I've got that. The second change that I've done is I've actually added a field where I can include the MLA works cited citation. And the reason that I added that is mostly out of convenience, but also if you are using something like Academic Search Complete, it will automatically generate that works cited entry for you. And so as long as I'm there, I might as well copy and paste it and keep it. And then if I do end up using that later on, I don't have to go back to Academic Search Complete or use Scribr or something like that to create a citation. And then the last sort of suggestion there is that you use something like Google Docs just because it won't disappear on you. So as I'm researching, I simply have a window open in the background. And if I come across a source I like, I just go ahead and start to fill in these things. Okay, so there you go. If you have any major concerns on plagiarism, please do let me know. There are some other good sources and resources to help you understand it a little bit more. But the moral of the story is, make sure that you're tracking your sources, make sure that you're citing your sources, and make sure that you know that just because you changed a couple words in that original, you're still essentially committing plagiarism if you do that. All right, so there you go. If you have questions, comments, concerns, jokes, memes, or recipes, please let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you all later.